Back at the beginning of summer of 2020, when my college friends and I were trying to entertain ourselves while the whole world was shut down, we had a little PowerPoint party where we just each kind of made a silly little PowerPoint and presented it to each other over Zoom. The PowerPoint that I made was top 8 people in the Bible most likely to break quarantine. My presentation included Ruth because of the time that Naomi said, "Go home," and Ruth was like, "No, I'm coming with you." I had Jonah in there for the whole fleeing to Nineveh thing, and I had Jacob on the list. The reason that I gave was that his name basically means troublemaker, and he really lived up to that. Now, the name Jacob doesn't directly translate into the word troublemaker, but there's no denying that the son of Isaac was trouble with a capital T. The name Jacob actually means he grasps the heel, because that's what he did to his twin brother when they were coming out of the womb. We skipped over a few stories from last week's passage to get to this week, but in the in-between of from Isaac on the top of Mount Moriah having this near escape of sacrifice, he then grew up to be a young man, and he married a woman named Rebekah. Rebekah then became pregnant with twins, Jacob and his brother Esau. As the story goes, the older twin was born all red and covered with hair, so naturally they named him Esau because it means hairy. The younger twin came out grabbing onto Esau's heel, so naturally he was given the name Jacob because it means he grasps the heel. Now, this phrase about grabbing the heel is also a Hebrew idiom that can mean deceiver or he cheats, which is why I said that his name basically means troublemaker. And trust me, Jacob really took that as a challenge. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the story of Jacob and Esau, but I'll run through it real quick so that if you need a little refresher, it can come back to you. When the time came for their father, Isaac, to give his blessing to the boys, Isaac was elderly and couldn't see very well anymore. He was supposed to give this blessing to the older son, Esau. But Rebekah, their mother, was a little bit upset that her little baby Jacob was going to get looked over. So she and Jacob cooked up this scheme together to try to deceive Isaac into getting the blessing for Jacob, the younger son, instead of Esau, the older son. Jacob covered himself in goat skin so that he could imitate Esau's hairiness, and he convinced his father Isaac that he was the elder son, and he received the blessing instead of the older son, Esau, getting this blessing. Now, by the time that Esau found out that his birthright had been stolen from him by his scheming little brother, it was too late for the blessing to be given to Esau instead, and too late for the blessing to be transferred over to Esau. Now, this isn't just Jacob being tricky and stealing the last piece of cake from the fridge or cheating at cards at family game night. The implications of Jacob deceiving his father meant that Jacob, as the youngest in the family, was essentially raised to the head of the family, and Esau would forever be second to him. Understandably, Esau was pretty upset by this. But he couldn't really do anything about it while his father was still alive, so Jacob had some time to get out of there and get himself safe before his brother could come after him. With the help of his mother again, Jacob was sent off to live with Rebekah's brother. And it's on this journey to his uncle's home that we find Jacob alone in the wilderness, grabbing a rock for his pillow and falling asleep under the stars. Now, if Jacob was a character in a movie, he might be painted as the scrappy underdog or the misunderstood younger brother or the innocent man just desperate to clear his name. But in reality, Jacob was a conniving schemer who fractured his family through rather selfish actions. Like I said, he's trouble with a capital T. So it is a bit of a shock when Jacob suddenly encounters the holy presence of God as he lays down to sleep that night. Let's keep in mind that this is probably the first time that Jacob has slept away from the safety of his family's tent. He's out in the wilderness all alone, exposed to the dangers of wild animals and robbers, not to mention knowing that his enraged brother could be coming after him at any moment. This is a situation where a different, perhaps more godly man might be found on his knees praying to God for safety. But Jacob just curls up and falls fast asleep. Clearly, he has no guilty conscience about what he's just done to his family. There's nothing keeping him awake at night. I point this out to make it clear that Jacob didn't do anything to summon the presence of God in his dream that night. There was no building of an altar, no sacrifice being made, no fearful or guilt-ridden prayer lifted up to God. Rather, what we find in the wilderness is God coming down to meet Jacob. In this dream, God has built an avenue from heaven to earth so that the presence of God could come and dwell with this troubled young man. I imagine that many of you are probably a bit familiar with this passage, and you might know it being called Jacob's ladder. Now, that's an inaccurate description, in part because, as I explained to the kids, it's actually a stairway, not a ladder. Biblical scholars say that the image that Jacob saw was probably similar to the ziggurat structures of the time. Ziggurats were a sort of temple with stairs leading up to a flat surface. If you've seen pictures of Aztec temples, it's probably a little bit more similar to that than if you're picturing the Egyptian pyramids with the pointed top. Now, this whole stairway versus ladder thing isn't quite as important to our understanding of the story. But the fact that it was not Jacob's ladder or Jacob's stairway actually is a pretty important point. It seems like a small piece of the story, but to really understand the full impact of this moment, it's important to recognize that God is the one who initiated this relationship between heaven and earth, this relationship between the divine God and the troublemaking Jacob. When we understand this fact, we can see how this story truly is a picture of what grace looks like. We don't find Jacob as a righteous or blameless man. We don't even find Jacob groveling for God's mercy. Rather, we see God choosing to come to Jacob, a deceiver who has been essentially booted from his own family, and instead of condemning him, God proclaims the same promises for Jacob's descendants as God had proclaimed over Jacob's grandfather, Abraham. A promise that would mean abundance and blessing for every generation. And furthermore, God gives Jacob a personal promise, saying, I am with you, and I will protect you wherever it is that you go. I love the way that Kathleen Norris describes this moment in her book, Amazing Grace. The author says, God's response to finding Jacob vulnerable, sleeping alone in the open country, is not to strike him down for his sins, but to give him a blessing. This story is such a beautiful picture of unmerited grace and of divine and perfect love. Jacob certainly had grown up hearing the stories about God from his parents and the stories of his grandfather Abraham with the God that they've come to worship. But we've seen no evidence in the Bible so far of Jacob having any sort of personal relationship with God. What we do see is a troublemaking child who grows up to be a troublemaking adult, a schemer and a deceiver who is all alone in the wilderness. And yet God holds none of this against him. And Jacob receives the freely given grace and mercy of God. Jacob is clearly so moved by this blessing that he wakes up rejoicing and praising to be in the presence of the Lord, declaring this space to be the very house of the God that his father and grandfather had worshipped. One of those thin spaces where we say that the veil between heaven and earth has been lifted. If this were the movie that I talked about with Jacob as the scrappy underdog, it could end right here with a happily ever after and Jacob is a changed man forever. But if you follow the rest of the story of Jacob, you'll see that his troublemaking tendencies carry on. Even in the last few verses of this chapter, the verses that we didn't read this morning, we see that Jacob still has that conniving glint in his eye. After he anoints his rock pillow as a memorial, Jacob begins to bargain with God, saying, if you take care of me and keep me safe and come through with all the promises that you've made, then I'll allow you to be my God. Even after this encounter with God, Jacob is still a little scoundrel as he tries to act like he might have some sort of power in this relationship. And yet, as Jacob maintains his troublemaking ways, we don't see God reneging on his promise or breaking these promises to Jacob to be Jacob's God. This promise that said that God would protect him and bless his children and his children's children and those children's children. As we'll see in the rest of the Bible, Jacob is not the only scoundrel to receive the grace and mercy of God. God continuously steps down from heaven to meet righteous people, unrighteous people, and all sorts of in-between people. God steps down the stairway from heaven to meet these people, coming as far as to step down onto earth as Jesus took on flesh, so that he could walk this journey of life with both saints and sinners alike. In the life and ministry of Jesus, we see God's perfect grace pouring out on imperfect people again and again and again. Like God in the desert wilderness with Jacob, Jesus continuously encounters people in their lowest state. Jesus continuously draws near to those with broken hearts and broken bodies and broken relationships. And he brings love and healing and restoration. Everywhere that Jesus walked is holy ground, because everywhere that Jesus walked is a place where God was dwelling. Every person that Jesus met was touched by the unmerited grace and mercy of our good and loving God. Jesus didn't just use this stairway to descend from heaven to earth, but Jesus actually became the bridge that would connect us to God for all of eternity. At the beginning of the Gospel of John, Jesus says, "Very truly I tell you, you will see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." This very Son of Man, who we are told came to seek and to save the lost ones. The Son of Man who came to proclaim good news for the poor, freedom for the prisoners, and healing for all those who are brokenhearted. The Son of Man who draws near to each one of us, just as God drew near to Jacob, and who wraps us up in his love. Biblical scholar Stan Mast says that the story of Jacob teaches us that you don't have to feel close to God for God to be near to you. You don't have to reach out to God for God to come to you, and you don't have to be a perfect person in order for God to bless you. This is the picture of who Jesus is and how Jesus comes to us. The Spirit of the Lord is present with each of us in our highs and our lows, whether we are aware of the presence or not. Jesus reaches his hand out to us even if we don't reach out to God. Whether it is our grief or our shame or our own prideful stubbornness that prevents us from reaching to God, God will step down from heaven to be with us. It doesn't matter who we are, doesn't matter what we've done, the perfect love of God is poured out to bless each and every one of us. When Jacob awoke from his dream, he declared that God was especially present in that space, and Jacob anointed it as a holy place. But in reality, God is especially present in every place, at every time. The gift of knowing Jesus is that we constantly have this mediator, someone we call our great high priest, who connects us to the presence of God. Now, I won't pretend like there aren't some spaces where it's a little bit easier to feel God's presence than others. For myself, I can say that those spaces certainly include the national parks where I've come to know God and the mountains again and again. And I'm sure that many of you have your own special places where you've been able to encounter God. But remember Jacob's words as he declared, "Surely the Lord was in this place, and I wasn't even aware of it." And know that those words are true in every single moment. Whether we're aware of it or not, the Lord is in this earth with us. Whether we're aware of it or not, each day we walk on holy ground as God proclaims blessings over us. You don't have to be in a special place because God is everywhere. You don't have to be a special person because God's grace is for everyone. The grace of God that promised Jacob and all of God's people, "I am with you, and I will protect you wherever you go." The Lord is in this place with us. Let it be so. Would you please pray with me? Gracious God, we thank you for the ways that you are near to us. Whether we are waking or sleeping, we thank you for the ways that you bless us and know us and love us. I pray that each day we will become more and more aware of your presence, more and more aware of the grace that you have freely given to us. Draw near to us, Lord, as we draw nearer and nearer to you. Pray this in your name. Amen.